This is Democracy Watch. So, Mark, today was the Supreme Court argument regarding Trump's presidential immunity that I think is safe to say was utter insanity. So, first off, so as not to bury the lead here, Trump's lawyer argued that a president having his political opponent assassinated could be considered an official act and that entitled him to immunity. Here's a clip of that moment.
How about if a president orders the military to stage a coup?
I think that, as the Chief Justice pointed out earlier, where there's a whole series of, sort of guidelines against that, so to speak, like the UCMJ prohibits the military from following a plainly unlawful act. If one adopted Justice Alito's test, that would fall outside. Now, if one adopts, for example, the Fitzgerald test that we advanced, that may well be an official act.
Okay, so what?
Honestly, Brian, I have seen a lot of things in my 30-plus years as a litigator. I never thought I would see a lawyer stand in the U.S. Supreme Court and say that a president who orders the assassination of their political opponent, he also said, by the way, a president who stages a coup would be engaged in official action. I never thought I would see that. And that was quite shocking. It was even more dismaying, though, Brian, that several of the justices on the U.S. Supreme Court seemed to think this made perfect sense to them.
Right. To that point, 3 of those justices actually then signaled an openness to actually sending this case back to the lower court to continue litigating, adjudicating some of these claims. What would that mean in terms of the D.C. case actually going to trial before the 2024 election?
Yeah, just to be clear, you're not even counting Justice Thomas and Justice Alito, who were the furthest out there in terms of supporting the Trump position. They may not even need to send.
Right, those people didn't even want to send it back. They were like, right. we're bought in. Let's go.
Right, but if the case got sent back, what it means is that there would not be a trial before the 2024 election. I mean, I've said all along, and we've talked about this, that Donald Trump was playing two games here. One, a long shot to actually try to win this argument, which I don't think he thought and his lawyers thought they had a chance, although after the argument today, they probably feel better than they did.
Yeah.
But the real gambit they were engaged in was trying to get this case sent back to the trial court with some type of new test or new standard that would then require further hearings by the trial court, which of course, those hearings would then be appealed to the DC Circuit, back to the US Supreme Court, all of this eating up lots and lots of time, and we'd be talking about sometime in 2025 before a trial could actually take place. I hate to say that Donald Trump may be getting away with it, but I think he may get away with it.
Mark, you've argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. How much can we glean from the questions that these justices ask? Like, do you feel that they basically tip their hands, or could they ask questions that don't suggest whether they'll rule one way or the other?
Yeah, so, I mean, look, you have to be careful about over-reading questions, particularly among justices that seem to be genuinely wrestling with the issues. I think that as I listened to this argument, it seemed to me that Justice Alito and Justice Thomas and really probably Justice Gorsuch were not really struggling with the issues. I think they know which way they want to go. They may be around the edges trying to figure out exactly how far immunity goes, but they're pretty far in that camp. I think on the other side, the 3 liberal justices seemed very, very skeptical of Donald Trump's position, and I think disinclined to do that. So that left Kavanaugh, the chief, and Justice Coney Barrett. I think you're right, by the way, that Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts both seemed intrigued with sending this case back. Coney Barrett maybe, although she was the most uneasy with this idea of immunity. So I think this is going to boil down to whether, frankly, the Chief Justice wants to write the opinion of the court. If he does, he'll either be able to pick a side with the conservatives, or if he can drag another justice along with the liberals. But I think it's going to be something in the middle. And I think likely a remand back to the trial court. Can
you explain that a little bit? Like, isn't it just that even if John Roberts is in the minority, would he have some sway here just by virtue of being the Chief Justice? What if the other 5 conservatives all agree full tilt with what Donald Trump's lawyers are arguing, that he has complete and total immunity?
Yeah, no, the Chief Justice only has very limited powers as Chief Justice. When it comes to voting on the outcomes, he's just one of the justices. So he doesn't get a special power, no special vote. So if there are 5 justices, say, to his right, who want to take a harder line, they'll get that opinion. My point only is that I think that a Chief Justice, any Chief Justice, and particularly John Roberts, when there's a historic opinion, he wants to be seen as the person who authored it. So I think he's going to be looking for a coalition, which is why I think he is centering around sending this case back because he probably figures he can get enough justices to punt that it gives him the ability to write the opinion. But you put a good point out there, which is it is also possible that you wind up with Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, and then gets Justice Barrett on board, and they just write an opinion, and he's left out.
Yeah. Mark, I'm trying to be measured here, but does it not blow your mind that conservative members of the court seem more concerned at the prospect of the president being prosecuted for committing crimes than just the president committing those crimes?
Yeah, it's astounding. I mean, it's absolutely astounding. Some of the arguments we heard today that were treated as serious arguments were, frankly, things that I would have said were beyond fringe just a few hours ago, 24 hours ago, 48 hours ago. For example, this idea that was floated, I think, by Justice Alito, that somehow if you don't provide presidents with absolute immunity or close to it, they won't leave office because they won't want to be prosecuted. Well, I mean, that seems entirely backwards.
If only we had 200 plus years of precedent to look back on.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that the reason why Donald Trump did what he did was not because he was afraid of being prosecuted. Right?
He wasn't afraid of leaving office. He didn't ever want to leave office. That was the whole point of this. They've got it completely backwards.
Yeah, so there were a lot of aspects to this argument that were frankly really astounding, disappointing. I mean, another point was, at various times the lawyer for the government kept trying to focus on the case before the judges, saying, look, like, you don't need to worry about these distant possible cases. Like, here you have a president who tried to use an armed insurrection to overturn a free and fair election. Let's just focus on these facts. And you heard some of the conservative justices say repeatedly, we don't want to talk about the facts. We don't want to talk about the facts of this case. And I'm thinking, what do you mean you don't want to talk about the facts of this case? This is the case that's before you.
Yeah.
So, it was a very, very peculiar argument. It was a very, very peculiar hearing. It went on for 3 hours. Normally I'd say you can't read too much into the questions, but a lot of the justices I felt like were really showing their hands. And look, Brian, if we worried about this being a test between conservative jurisprudence, originalism and textualism on one side, and some type of loyalty or outcome determinative predilection to be in favor of Donald Trump, there was no question of where the questioning lined up here, because there was no textualist argument. There's nothing in the Constitution that provides immunity for the president, even though, by the way, it does provide it for members of the House and Senate. There's no originalist argument here. There's nothing that was in the original debates that suggested they thought they were giving presidents immunity. In fact, remember, the country had just revolted from a king, right? Far from wanting to give immunity to the chief executive, they were quite suspicious of executive power. So, I hesitate to say this because I care as a lawyer and as someone who's argued for the Supreme Court in the integrity of the courts. And Lord knows, let's hope that the questioning is not indicative of where we wind up. But it is possible we wind up with an opinion that does not look anything like what we would normally expect out of a court.
This is like anti-originalism, basically. And to that exact point, what would happen if the tables were turned and it was Joe Biden who was in Donald Trump's spot here, and it was Biden's lawyers who were arguing for full presidential immunity? Do you think that they would be making the exact same arguments that, again, completely undermine all of their previously stated positions as textualists, as originalists?
I'm hard pressed to think they would. I mean, I think it's extremely unlikely. I also think it's extremely unlikely that President Biden would trash the Constitution to such an extent to send his lawyers into court to argue that he could engage in the assassination of his political opponents. So I think it's an extreme hypothetical that is unlikely and unfortunate in many respects. But you put your finger on one of the things that I worry about for the future, which is, they say they're not deciding just this case. They don't want to focus on the facts here, that this is for future presidents. But it will, if they rule as extremely as it's possible they do you really trust that in the future they would not reverse themselves if, in fact, the political situation was different?
Well, you mean after they've shown themselves to have so much integrity?
This is going to be as tough as the cases that have come before it have been for the American public to accept. Dobbs and a lot of these cases where you're just left asking, how is this possible? I have to say, if the court is worried about its institutional integrity, it's going to be a very, very difficult road if they wind up saying that the President of the United States can engage in political assassinations, presumably, by the way, against Supreme Court justices too.
Right.
I mean, while he's at it, he could assassinate members of the House, members of the Senate, other branches of government. It just, I think, is a very dangerous place in our democracy we are right now if the Supreme Court were to take this extremist view.
Well, I guess the obvious question here is, if the Supreme Court rules in the way that it looks like they may rule, then what's to stop Joe Biden, other than his integrity, but I'm asking this kind of tongue-in-cheek, what's to stop Joe Biden from just seeking to jail Donald Trump the day after the decision is handed down? I mean, if a president doesn't have to follow the Constitution, yeah, exactly, like you're about to say cancel the election. Why not do it?
This is why I have to believe that despite all of the provocative questioning, despite the 3 hours of arguments, I have to believe at the end of the day the Chief Justice is going to wrangle into a 5-vote coalition a more sensible outcome. Now, the price that may be paid there will likely be the delay, a remand and a delay. And by the way, that in and of itself is no victory. Like, we cannot let the frog be boiled here. We cannot say that somehow if that happens, this was a victory. Right. Because a victory in this case for the rule of law is that Donald Trump goes on trial like yesterday, that there's no further delays. So that wouldn't be a victory, but I have to think that is still the most likely outcome.
Right, we can't let the Overton window shift so much that the pittance that we would be given, which would be further delay of Donald Trump finally being held accountable for his crimes on January 6th, would seem like a reasonable alternative to just allowing full-blown presidential immunity for committing crimes while in office. Kind of in the same way how we shouldn't accept like a 15-week abortion ban after we had Dobbs for 50 years, because Donald Trump says, well, look, I'm not gonna say a 6-week abortion ban. I'll give you 15 and seem like the white knight in response to that, just because we've kind of become normalized to all of the rule of law, all of our rights kind of being chipped away at.
Yeah, this is the modus operandi of Donald Trump. It is to say something outrageous, to argue something outrageous, to advance a position that is completely outrageous, and then normalize it through the Republican Party, through his surrogates, through the Federalist Society, normalize it through Fox News, and then at the end of it, when he doesn't get everything that he wants, people are like, oh, well, look, there was a splitting of difference. And we cannot let that happen with issues that are core to democracy. Right,
we can't just do extremism -1 and think that that's okay. Mark, I want to turn your attention to this moment from Ketanji Brown Jackson.
You seem to be worried about the president being chilled. I think that we would have a really significant opposite problem if the president wasn't chilled. If someone with those kinds of powers, the most powerful person in the world, with the greatest amount of authority, could go into office knowing that there would be no potential penalty for committing crimes. I'm trying to understand what the disincentive is from turning the Oval Office into, the seat of criminal activity in this country.
What would be the incentive if these judges rule that a president is above the law?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say, we talked a lot about the conservative justices here. Justice Jackson was brilliant today.
Yeah.
This was obviously an argument that she took very seriously coming in. She was very prepared with excellent questions. And I think this point was a really, really important one, which is that, we look back on history, and for you and I, and for most of our viewers, it was history, but about the Nixon era, when there was kind of a criminal conspiracy going on in the Oval Office. And the lesson that history taught us was that at the end of it, Richard Nixon had to resign and then receive a presidential pardon. If, in fact, there was no criminal sanction possible at the end of that rainbow, then, in today's world in which, Mitch McConnell and his would never vote for a conviction to impeach a Republican president, that ongoing criminal conspiracy in the Oval Office would continue. It would not have ended, and it would give a Donald Trump-like figure every incentive to do exactly that.
Right. Not only does it disincentivize you from running for president, it actually incentivizes a criminal from doing it because it's just a magic force field around you, which is exactly what Donald Trump wants as he's contending with 88 criminal charges right now.
Right. And when he wants to, for example, violate the emoluments clause, remember that? When he wants to sell businesses to the Saudis or to Russia, right? It is a problem to immunize anyone from all criminal behavior, because anyone who can get away with anything without being subject to criminal laws is dangerous. It is particularly dangerous when that person is also the most powerful person in the world, the President of the United States.
Samuel Alito is 74 years old. Clarence Thomas is 75. John Roberts and Sotomayor are both 69. The next president may very well nominate the replacement for one of, if not all of these justices. Talk about what's at stake if Trump wins in November, especially in light of what we saw today.
Look, Donald Trump said in a candid moment that he wants to be a dictator. Then he paused, realized that this might not be great. I think Sean Hannity prompted him, and he said he just wants to be dictator for a day. Well, if Donald Trump can get immunity, absolute immunity from prosecution for any crimes he commits in office, if he becomes president of the United States, I expect he will conduct himself in a criminal manner from start to finish. Whether the Supreme Court is with him or against him, he will just be the criminal that he is. Now, the fact that he will also then be able to make the court majority even worse or more conservative and more beholden to him. I mean, just imagine the tactics he would use in choosing cabinet officials, choosing new Supreme Court members. So this is a critical election for so many reasons. It is even more critical if, in fact, the Supreme Court holds Donald Trump above the law in some respect. And if they remand it, it is critical that he not be in office because he needs to stand trial. And if he's not going to stand trial in these federal cases before November, he needs to stand trial after November. And if he's put back in Oval Office, we know that's not going to happen.
Well, look, Mark, you've been a leader in signaling the alarm about what's happening in the courts right now. So for those watching, if you want to continue to support the work that Mark and his team do, the invaluable work that they do, please sign up for Democracy Docket up at the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. It's the free news outlet Mark founded to focus on everything voting in elections, which, again, is ground zero right now. With that said, I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Mark Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.